I observed tonight from Grand Valley State University, one Hope College, one Aquinas. My wife's a graduate of Aquinas. My dad was chaplain at Hope College. And I was a trustee on the Grand Valley board for a few years, and understand what a very rich institution Grand Valley is after just 50 years, 50th anniversary this year. If ever there is an example of leadership and the difference that leaders can make, I like to point to Grand Valley State University. When I was in my freshman year in the State House, we were in one of those economic crises with a huge budget deficit. At the time, Grand Valley was in its infancy, a very small school, just a few thousand students in the middle of many cornfields in Allendale. The fieldhouse roof had collapsed, and the school wasn't certain how they were going to repair that. And as we were wrestling with the budget deficit back then, a number of legislators said it is time to consider closing universities in the state. And let's start with the newer universities. Really, it's time to think about closing Grand Valley. Don Lubbers, then president, rallied community leaders, and he really rallied the community leaders not just over the political question, should Grand Valley stay open or not during this budget crisis, but around the vision he had for the school. And it was a very powerful vision because really there was no public university before Grand Valley in West Michigan. And he saw Grand Valley as an anchor institution that would be accessible to students who couldn't afford private school tuition. Ultimately, he had the vision that Grand Valley should not just be a campus in Allendale, but should be a force of development in Grand Rapids, the city of Grand Rapids. And in 50 short years, all that has come true, far beyond probably even Don Lubbers' expectations. I've asked him that before. Did you ever dream that Grand Valley would become such a first-class institution? But Don and the successor presidents have given the school the leadership that really, I believe, holds the key to the future of West Michigan, which was exactly what Don felt was so important about Grand Valley when he helped get it started and fought for its existence during legislative battles. Throughout what has been a 40-year journey for me, I have worked with and around some very special leaders who, for me, served as mentors and role models. That first congressman I worked for, Phil Ruppe, who represented Northern Michigan, was a moderate Republican congressman, and a man whose character I respected very deeply. In serving in Lansing, worked most closely with a couple of Republican governors, William Milliken and John Engler, who again were outstanding leaders, very different people, but whom I became very close to during their service. I could mention Detroit Renaissance chairman and CEO of Comerica Bank, Gene Miller, or ultimately my boss at DTE Energy, now working in California, but Detroit Renaissance chair and CEO of DTE Energy, Tony Early. The interesting thing about this group of leaders who were models for me is that they were very different people, had very different strengths. And I will emphasize strengths. We all have weaknesses, but what makes great leaders is their strengths. But if I had to think about what they had in common, this is a list I came up with. All were motivated as leaders by and true to core values that they held and their aspirations, or a very strong sense of purpose. Why were they leading? They were comfortable in their own skins. They all had healthy egos, but they didn't allow those egos to diminish the primary importance of their leadership teams in the public sector, their constituents in the private sector, customers, employees, and other stakeholders. Very comfortable with themselves, but looked beyond themselves. They were problem solvers, or as Gleaves talked about, decision makers. They recognized in that process of decision making the necessity of compromise between opposing parties and diverse viewpoints. And finally, they all understood the importance of the decision-making or consensus-building process, but also cared deeply about where the process was leading, the results. And they saw in themselves their role as stewards of the institutions they led, and beyond the institutions they led, stewards of the communities they were serving. Those were and are the common strengths of these leaders. And so with that as context, let me just briefly talk about what I've learned in my own journey, lessons learned from these individuals I've just mentioned. A lot of what I'll talk about is based on where my own leadership experience was forged, the public sector. But Gleaf said it earlier, I really do believe that leaders strong leaders have very common qualities that carry over from the public sector to the not-for-profit sector to the private sector. But I'm going to talk more about some of the lessons I learned tonight in the public sector, salting in some overlap with the private sector experience. First of all, and this may be a matter of personal leadership style, but I have learned over time that most of the strong leaders I've dealt with are more pilots than dictators or autocrats. And what do I mean by that? In the old days, the powerful leaders in a House of Representatives, the speakers of the House, tended to be very autocratic. I remember speaking to a former speaker who was from Holland a couple of decades before I served as speaker. And he told me a story about how great it was to be able to pass state budgets on the back of envelopes. And I asked him, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, the only two people who really understood in the House what we were appropriating in a given year were myself and the appropriations chair, and we usually worked it out on a tabletop and wrote it down on the back of the envelope. And no one really saw the detail of what they were voting on. And I thought to myself, those days are really pretty much gone. For one thing, in the public sector, freedom of information, open meetings requirements, all are geared towards involving more people in the process. But it's more than that. And this crosses over into the three sectors. It's the era of instantaneous electronic communication. There really are very few secrets left anymore. In fact, we tend to share everything we know, and if anything, deal with information overload. And so what does that mean for the leaders of today? It means that leaders have to be very adroit, adept managers of the process, steer the process, working with a lot of communication with their teams, and respecting the diversity of viewpoints that exist in those teams. The leadership training that I have done in the private sector, Center for Creative Studies, we're doing a culture building process right now at DTE Energy with a company that's worked with Fortune 500 firms, Delaney, all emphasize the strengths that come through diversity of leadership. That the very successful CEOs look for leadership styles and personality traits that are different than their own. And collectively, if you work well as a team, come up with stronger results. Now, that's not to say that leaders just go with the flow or let the teams take you where you will. A strong leader today steers. And when I would go into a caucus, and I used to refer to working with my Republican caucus members as herding cats. It was everyone represented their own district. They had very different viewpoints, very different interests, and it was very hard to achieve a consensus. So I knew going into a caucus meeting, and I know today, going into a meeting of very diverse leaders at DTE Energy, and certainly did know this with very strong personalities at Detroit Renaissance, I knew that I had to go into a meeting where a decision had to be made with a very definite idea of where I wanted that meeting to end up. And I did my best to ask a lot of questions, steer in the direction that I hoped we would end up. But sometimes there would be twists and turns, and sometimes even different results than I anticipated. But I always went in with a very specific idea of where we should try to end up, and let then diversity take its course. Steering is not reacting then. It's listening. It's doing a lot of listening, and when you think about who are the most successful negotiators, consensus builders in the groups you work with, I bet many of them are the ones who ask the best questions and do a lot of listening, and then come up with some ideas that reflect different viewpoints in the room and build towards consensus. Another thing I'll say about steering is that it requires a great deal of communication. One thing that John Engler did so well when I was minority leader and then Speaker of the House and was working closely with Governor Engler was that he would meet with the Republican leadership team weekly to go over agendas, to hear from us, what did the landscape look like in the House. And I would do the same thing with my leadership team in the House. We would review every week. What are the key issues that are going to come up in committee? What do the votes look like? Do we have to make adjustments? Two-way communication. And here I jump over to the private sector. But what made my former CEO boss at DTE Energy so successful? I think of the first meeting I had with him after moving from Detroit Renaissance to DTE, where the first thing he said to me was, in my role, people like to tell me what they think I want to hear. And your job is to tell me what I need to hear and may not want to hear. But I expect that kind of two-way communication. You will make me stronger by being constructively critical when you need to be. I think in the steering role, that kind of two-way communication is absolutely essential for strong leadership. A word on steward of the institution. The Republicans in the State House had been in the minority for some 24 consecutive years. And so it was quite a day when, after the election, we thought we had finally won a majority. This was 1992. And not only had we thought won the majority, but had defeated the current Speaker of the House. And so it was with some surprise that I received a phone call from the defeated Speaker of the House the day after the election, and he asked me to come over and meet with him. And what he said I will never forget. He said, "You are likely to become the next Speaker of the House, and so what you are about to experience is the adventure of a lifetime, but also the burden of a lifetime. Your job will be to protect and defend the integrity and the civility and the problem-solving culture of the House." That's essentially what he said. that is what I mean by stewardship of the institution. He cared deeply about the institution. Here he was, a defeated candidate as a result of activity of the Republicans that I led. And the next day, he was not focused on revenge, but on what's the future of the House. When you think about the culture of any institution, it really rests with the people who make it up. And relationships depend on trust, and trust starts with integrity. The first piece of advice I received in legislative orientation as an incoming freshman in the House was from a lobbyist who was a former state senator, who said, all of you freshmen will be bringing to this institution the same asset on day one, and that is your integrity and your reputation. And some of you will squander that, he said. And he said, once you violate the trust, once you break the standard of integrity, you will never get it back in this place. Protect your integrity first and foremost, and work on building relationships of trust. A second aspect of stewarding an institution is really the decision-making process. Without showing genuine respect for others who have very different viewpoints, maybe very different personalities, the process is going to break down quickly, and we see that a lot in public institutions today, where civility seems to be a forgotten concept all too often. But process is so important. This is where I'll talk a little bit about Detroit Renaissance. It was a real culture shock for me to move from the public sector, where sometimes process overwhelmed results. We spent so much time trying to figure out how we would arrive at consensus. Sometimes the result was secondary. Well, all of a sudden I'm working with a group of CEOs of very large companies who are focused almost entirely on results and really are very impatient about process. And so, for example, when Detroit Renaissance became involved in Detroit public school reform and decided to engage in a campaign to keep what had been a 5-year experiment of governance where school board members were appointed, not elected, we honestly, as an organization, failed miserably in that campaign. And I think in part it was because we didn't pay enough attention to the process of building trust in the community. There have been many failed attempts at reform of schools in Detroit, and we're going to try again, Mike, and I hope this one is more successful. But I think one thing those who mean well, and I'm thinking of what was my own board and myself at Detroit Renaissance, but policymakers as well, we need to remember that Detroit citizens don't want a lecture, they want a partner. They really want a genuine partner. And that involves process, respect, and building of trust before you could ever achieve the results you would like. I could digress a bit on what legislative term limits has done to process and the institution, but if you want to talk about that when we get into discussion, I would be happy to. I think it's an example where, with the best of intentions, the people of the state thought that this would be a helpful reform, and in many ways it has hurt the legislative decision-making process. Last point, the role of leaders as steward of the community. I live in a Plymouth neighborhood now, and though it's not that far from Lansing in distance, it seems like across a continent in terms of how people view the world. And so often I deal with neighbors or friends in the community who are extremely cynical about the political process in the public sector. And they tend to roll their eyes when I say, you know, honestly, the people I served with, for the most part, were very decent men and women who really wanted to leave the community a better place. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, why the cynicism, why the perception of the public sector today? I do think the problem starts with us as voters. When you really think about it, the most elections today are decided in primaries, and in Michigan that's in August. But most districts today are safely Democratic and safely Republican, and so the key election is in the primary, not in the general election. And because only 15 to 20% on a good election day turn out to vote in a primary, the people who tend to come out to vote are those on the extremes for the most part. Very liberal, very conservative, conservative Republican, liberal Democrat. And so you tend to get in the legislature and in our Congress today people who, when they have to move towards the center to consensus build, worry mostly about being reelected in the primary, not a general election, and tend to go to the extremes. Now, that's not to say there isn't a middle, but increasingly today we're seeing the two sides polarized, showing up in Washington and the state capitals. The other issue is how we run campaigns today. They're very expensive. They tend to be very negative about the institutions of government, so negative that it is extremely hard for for the victors, the elected representatives, to govern after they've won, because they've helped to undermine confidence and helped to create the cynicism, which does impede the ability to build the kind of trust you need to make decisions. Now, this is not just a government problem. I mean, I think if you look at the polls about where private sector institutions, even some not-for-profit institutions stand today, there's a great level of mistrust. And, you know, partly in those sectors, I think it's about information overload, global economy, a sense of loss of control over people's lives, and generally, in the way we communicate, having your own views reinforced on the polarized end. So if you're conservative, tune into Fox, and if you're more liberal, turn into MNBC, or listen to your talk radio show of choice. But that does mean more polarization. I go into this a little bit because what is the role of a community steward in this kind of climate? What I've learned from my experience is, first and foremost, successful servant leaders don't view the process, as important as that is, don't view the process as an end unto itself. Are in the process to begin with because they have a higher calling and want to achieve results that are there, that are designed to build a stronger community, to create a greater good. The process, the seeking of power, should not be an end unto itself. If you are a minority member in a political process or have a minority viewpoint in the private or not-for-profit sectors, it's your obligation not just to say no, but to come up with a positive alternative. Probably one of the most fulfilling experiences for me was serving as minority leader of a Republican caucus that had been in the minority for so long that we had developed what I called minority mentality, where we felt a good day for us was giving strong speeches on the House floor against what the majority was going to pass. We started on the journey of becoming a majority when we decided we were going to shed that minority mentality And how did that happen? I can't take credit for this. I mean, I wanted to change minority mentality as minority leader, but I didn't quite have all the answers to that. It was a couple of members in our caucus who came to me and said, we all want the state to be stronger, to be a better place. We disagree with what the majority is saying about how we get there. But let's set up a process ourselves about what we would do if we were in control. What is our vision for the state? And out of that discussion came a series of task forces of Republicans who went around the state, did a lot of listening, but developed their own reports in a variety of areas: economic development, education, child care, health care, environment. And I knew that we had shed our minority mentality when the Detroit Free Press, who didn't much like Republicans, commented on one of our task force reports and said, this House Republican group may be the smallest group in number in Lansing, but they're developing the best ideas. And it was that higher calling, the refusal just to say no, but to come up with positive alternatives, that ultimately, I believe, allowed us to become a majority. The other lesson I learned was when, after a week after that election, where I described in 1992 our finally winning a majority, we discovered we weren't going to be a majority, but in fact, after one recount, the voters had saddled the House with 55 Republicans and 55 Democrats. And for about 3 months after the election, both parties gave their best shot to seizing control. The Democrats tried to pass a resolution which stated if the deadlock is not resolved going into January, the new year, whoever controlled the House in the previous legislature would control the House in the new legislature. That was rather clever. I mainly spent my time trying to find a traitorous Democrat who would switch parties, and failed at that. Finally, the two of us who were leaders sat down in a Holt bar and got to know each other. And we hadn't really worked closely on the same committees together, so we really were becoming acquainted with each other. And we learned we had similar aspirations for the institution. That this was 1992 was the year term limits was enacted by the people. There was a great deal of cynicism about the legislature. We both wanted to change that view of the House, and we wanted it to be something that people would be proud of. That led to discussions of how we would share power, and ultimately we came up with a process which the pundits said was doomed to failure, but ended up surviving the 2 years where one party would preside on the House floor for a month, and in that same month the other party would run the committees, and then we'd flip the positions. So essentially each party had 2 months, one in committee and then one on the floor to run their agenda, and then it was the other party's turn. And initially we thought this was going to be kind of a crazy experience where each side would give it their best shot and they'd jam through their agenda, and then they'd have to turn over power to the other side. You know what happened? Through that sharing of power, and it started in the committees, the co-committee chairs started talking with each other about what should the agenda for a given month look like. And they started to cooperate in preparing the agenda. And well, they should have, because the committees were evenly divided. Nothing was going to go forward in the House, either in committee or on the House floor, without some bipartisan decision-making. And that same kind of cooperation evolved between the two of us who were co-speakers. It ended up being one of the most productive sessions in many years, and I don't think the public approval rating has been higher than it was after that 2 years in the 3 decades I'm familiar with the legislature. Now, what did I learn from that experience is that leadership is about putting the community first, You've got to have a healthy institution to do that. But what motivated us in that 2 years was trying to move forward an agenda that we didn't always agree on, but both sides were coming up with their best ideas and trying to move them through the process for what we hoped would be a benefit to the state. It was about risk-taking. I started talking about the importance of diversity and team building. What I learned from that 2 years was that having control of a process, being a leader, being in charge, sometimes requires that you take the risk of handing over the agenda to someone you may disagree with often, and letting that person put forward his or her best idea, and let's talk about it, let's deliberate it. And out of that kind of risk-taking, letting go of some of that power, sharing some of that power, I really felt we had a healthier institution, and we were serving the community, in this case the state, better than we had in the traditional partisan role. So those are some of my experiences. I'll summarize. Again, I think leaders have to be grounded by core values, starting with integrity, and clear, inspiring sense of purpose or vision. Pilot, not dictator. Committed to team building, and believing that strength can be forged from diversity, because it can with the right leadership. Steward of the institution and its processes by which decisions are made, and a champion or exemplar of civility and consensus building. And finally, a steward of the community. This may seem a little Pollyannish, but when you think about it, whatever our leadership roles are, we want to leave the institution stronger and the community stronger. I hope that's what we all want for our children and future generations to come. And really, that's as important as anything as a motivator. I'll say this about DTE today. When I started there, most of our talk was about the bottom line. How, as a company, are we going to achieve our financial metrics, our projected financial outcomes for the year? Over time, what has evolved in our culture is a focus on customers, employee engagement, how can we continuously improve how we tackle problems in our company, and how can we improve our relationships in the political and regulatory community process. And if we do those four things well, customers, employee engagement, continuous improvement, and the political regulatory environment, the bottom line will take care of itself. I really believe, whether it's public sector, private sector, that last value, steward of the community, is absolutely critical to an institution's success and the leader's success.